Welcome to Slash Forward. In this double episode, we're going to work through the 1990 adaptation of Stephen King's It. Let's get to it. We open on a montage of scrapbooking, an eternal cosmic monster's favorite diversion, eventually settling in on the rotting, soulless town of Derry. This little girl pedals home enjoying the high of training hard for her first Ironman, when she hears a chuckle emanating from the wash. As is so often the case, it turns out to be Tim Curry. We learn that her mom found her in pieces and that she's number 6 in a string of child murders, cluing us in that
something terribly wrong
is afoot. When Mike finds a picture of Georgie, a victim from 30 years prior, at the crime scene, he knows it's time to start making some calls. From work, of course. These are long-distance calls, after all. He starts with Bill, who happens to be focusing all of his attention on punching up a screenplay and taming that wild mane. The sound of Mike's voice instantly floods his mind with memories long forgotten, and he takes a moment to reminisce. We find Georgie was his younger brother. Bill, too sickly to play, sends him off in the rain with a paper boat. He zips along the gutters too fast and loses his new toy down a storm drain. Luckily, this kindly clown comes in for the save. Pennywise breaks the ice with introductions and entices him to come close so he can chomp him. And to death, if that wasn't clear. When feeling nostalgic later, Bill goes thumbing through a photo album and is surprised when Georgie gives him a cheeky little wink and then starts bleeding all over. We learn this is for him alone, as his parents can't see it, nor do they care about his emotional turmoil, scolding him for disturbing his brother's room. Modern-day Bill then heads immediately for Derry. After this, we transition to Ben, enjoying the trappings of a baller lifestyle, winning awards for architecture and not caring, drinking with strangers, living in a warehouse, being a handsome man. His boner is utterly destroyed, however, by the sound of Mike's voice. We learn that folks don't remember much about Derry once they leave, so the unexpected connection to their past and the dark obligation hanging over them is fairly alarming. In his flashback, we learn Ben was new to Derry, a history buff and a horn dog. His girth immediately attracts the attention of Henry Bowers, town greaser and medium-sized fish in a very small pond. On the way home, we see Henry compensates for this by taking his bullying to an extreme level, threatening to spill Ben's Fruit Loops all over the sidewalk. Ben escapes via a nutshot and a backflip, hiding out until the trouble passes. He then emerges to meet Bill and his friend Eddie. Later on, he also writes a poem for Beverly Marsh, a girl he loves because she talked to him once. And he has his own interaction with Pennywise, a common thread of these flashbacks. When that's all done and remembered, modern-day Ben also heads to Derry. This segues us to Beverly Marsh, fashion mogul, and her shitbag partner and boyfriend Tom, who kisses like a maniac. On the heels of sealing a huge deal, she gets the dreaded call. She begins to pack, but Tom don't like his ladies coming and going freely, so she's forced to bean him with a jar of vanity mayonnaise and hops a cab. Her flashback starts with the poem previously mentioned, but Daddy don't cotton to young lads, taking a romantic interest in his personal property, and we find that his behavior defines her future relationships. In an attempt to connect with her, Ben invites her to the Barrens for some fun, a decision that ends all hope for his romantic future when she meets Bill. We're then introduced to Wisecrack and Richie, best in small doses, and Stan, a Cub Scout. The group gets to damming up the crick, celebrating their success and diverting nature from her course through sheer will. They split up, and we learn Bev assumes Bill wrote the poem because he's hot. She then has her Pennywise interaction in the form of a sink drain, providing a bloody surprise. We speed up now as Eddie packs to leave. In his memory, we learn that gym teacher is acutely aware of which boys did or did not shower. Dirty boys cannot be included in his collection, you see. While there, we get the expected supernatural happenings, including Pennywise getting wet with Eddie, defining his future relationships. After this, we transition to Richie, who's one of those types of comedians. You know, a hack. He gets his call in the green room, then tries to make arrangements with his manager for a few days off. In his flashback, we see the gang approached by an Irish beat cop, providing the sound advice they stick together. Because of all the child murders, you know? And we learn this is not just applicable to the scary outside world, as Richie finds himself making a mess in the cafeteria and seeking out the service of the janitor. This results in him finding himself alone in the boiler room, where he's confronted by none other than Teen Wolf himself. Back in modern Derry, we learn how Mike got involved in all this. He was also a cast-off of sorts, enthusiastic about telling everyone the dark past of Derry and its punctuated historical periods of mass murder. Although he could be bullied for his eagerness to learn, he ends up being selected for special attention, mostly for racial reasons. We learn Henry Bowers really doesn't like it when people have different types of bodies. Out at the old abandoned construction site, we learn the group of close friends are finally talking, confirming all of them but Stan have had unsettling clown experiences that summer. This is where their paths collide with Mike, as he comes over the hill, running from Bowers and his crew and begging for help. Bill and the others decide to take a stand right there with the tried and true anti-bullying technique of smashing faces with rocks, eventually driving them off. Afterward, they relax by perusing Mike's historical historical research and coming across an old lithograph that confirms Pennywise's timeless nature. They then have a shared supernatural experience that also brings Mike and Stan into the fold with the rest of the group. This brings us to Stan, enjoying the classic hijinks of Larry and Balky, living a simple life, soon ruined by a call from Mike. Stan had the hardest time, having experienced the worst of Pennywise. We learned that they had a plan to kill it by slingshotting some silver earrings into its grill. They huffed some PCP to prepare their bodies and minds for violence and dissent, pursuing the ancient evil with the bullies hot on their heels. One of the bullies splits off and is subsumed by a supernatural energy. The others grab Stan, finding a quiet spot where they intend to kill his body. They're interrupted, however, when an unseen entity bursts from a pipe to fold up Belcher as a snack and delicately take him away. Then it returns, turning Bauer's hair stark white. Stan escapes and regroups. They all link hands and use togetherness to wither its power. Pennywise tries to break them, but they resist and are granted an opportunity for Beverly to bust its dome wide open. But before they can finish it, he pulls a triple gainer into the drain and flushes himself straight down to hell, leaving them unsure of whether or not they finish the job. So they make a pact to come back and do so if it ever returns. This brings us back to modern-day Stan, who went from phone to tub, where he promptly opened his wrists rather than facing the horror. We're acting, and scene. And here we are, back with part 2, which opens with Bill's arrival in Derry. He stops at the cemetery first to pay his respects. His intimate moment is almost immediately ruined by Pennywise, real psyched to show off all the fresh graves he dug for Bill and his friends. Hey, that's convenient. He then heads to the library, checking first to ensure he's been adequately revered in his hometown, and then stands silently until noticed because his ego knows no bounds. Bill's memories continue to come back in fragments, and he discovers Mike doesn't have the same trouble, never having left. So Mike acts as a guide to rebuilding their prior experiences. To help Bill on his path, he pulls out the old steel horse, hoping to recreate some of the positive vibes that helped guide them through that fateful summer. Richie is next up and attempts to await Mike's return to the library. However, he's taunted by these exploding blood sacks, and then forced to listen in horror as Pennywise does his act better than him. With his self-confidence now in tatters, he leaves a message and heads out. Back with Mike, we see that Bill's been tuning up the old two-wheeled steed. You know what that calls for? Bike stunt montage! Or the closest to it these two Barneys can muster. In a couple of quickies, we see Ben arrive in town, suffering hallucinations along the way, and then Eddie rolls in, first stopping at the pharmacy. It jogs a latent memory of the time the pharmacist reveals his inhaler is a placebo. But he wants to be sickly, damn it! He finds Gus is still in the back, measuring out medications despite his broken brain. And then Eddie just gets a partial confrontation, not a full-on Pennywise. Then we find Beverly at her family home. She rings for Marsh and finds her dad has died, and Mrs. Kirsch has been squatting here for 5 years running. She's invited in and tries to enjoy some tea and biscuits, but this sloppy old bitch laps it up like a Labrador. And also, she's her father. Meanwhile, Bill's wife Audra learns that taking a couple days off will essentially ruin his career in the film industry forever. Given the stakes, she calls in a flight reservation, determined to go retrieve him. That evening, they all gather at the local small-town Asian fusion restaurant. Beverly walks in and swoons from a memory surge, and then breaks the ice by talking about her experience, which also clears Eddie's brain fog. Before things get too heavy, though, Richie lubricates the party wagon, and they begin the mukbang. The only real dialogue from this part confirms that Henry Bowers went crazy after gazing directly upon its visage, compelling him to confess to the child murders. They all head back to the library, and Richie hams it up while Mike tries to get in contact with Stan, the only member of the gang still missing. He gets word of the suicide, and they're all shaken, realizing Stan was the only one to see it in non-clown form, which doesn't bode well for them if they ever happen to stare into its deadlights. Pennywise then takes another crack at scaring them off with a vision of Stan's head, bleeding all over the Snicker bar Mike left in the mini-fridge, and then fires off some abnormal indoor weather events. They only fend him off with the power of their bond, which flows through them from scalp to loins, apparently causing Bill to climax here. With that done, and since it looks like someone broke in anyway, they grab some free books and jet. At the psych ward with Henry Bowers, we learn from Pennywise, using his old chum as a proxy, that it can only get the kids if they believe. But Henry's corporeal form can murder them regardless, so it tries to enlist his help. He builds trust by gifting him an old friend, and then helping him walk out of the facility in a truly baffling manner. Clown dog! We then see that Audra has finally arrived in Derry, which is great. But she's drawn in by the power of the deadlights, which is not so great. I'm gonna call this one a wash. Meanwhile, back at the spot, the gang is all sharing stories when Mike, Ben, and Eddie take a break to grab some items from their rooms. They play it safe and leave their doors open. Unfortunately, Mike is pounced upon and receives a little poke between the ribs. Ben and Eddie break into his room, and in the scuffle, Henry guts himself. They all squeeze into Richie's IROC and rush him to the hospital. While they await news of his condition, we find that Bev is just fed up with this business.
Why is it so mean?
You get him, girl. Eventually, Mike comes out of surgery and we learn he's gonna be okay, but with some recovery time ahead. Mike advises everyone to stay silent about the incident due to the hold Derry's general malaise has on the adults, and he directs Bill to a key item for their quest. They keep the body under wraps and saunter out, playing it real cool. The whole gang's preparing to head to the airport, but Bill delivers a rousing speech, so they go to the Barrens instead, with a slingshot. So woefully ill-equipped for monster hunting. They arrive at the scene of the prior altercation and help Bill work through a vision of his brother. Then Pennywise appears and tries to warn them off one last time. Here, he's an apparition, but Bill suggests that it has to take a physical form to feed, so if they find it, they can kill it. The boat leads them straight to its bachelor pad. Inside, they find Audra, and we get indications that it behaves like a spider in its natural habitat. Then we see that it looks like a spider, but with big burly arms for hugging. Aw, that's not so bad. It is initially unfazed by the silver ingots they sling at it, but then when it rears up to show them its belly, Eddie defiantly states that he doesn't believe in it and tries his old trick, but only manages to get his ribcage crushed for his efforts. Then Beverly takes the opportunity to pop one of its deadlights, causing great distress. Not wanting to leave anything to chance and angry about Eddie, they mob on that sucker, ripping it open and playing with its insides like some true sickos. I'm really proud of them, to be honest. Then all the victims start descending like dingleberries, and our friends grab some of their favorite corpses to take topside. To wrap up, we find Mike is preparing to finally leave Derry, and that now the nightmare times are being covered by the brain fog. Audra is stuck between the dark and the light, unless maybe, just maybe, the thrill of a near-death pleasure ride could bring her back. Oh, okay. And that was Stephen King's It, the miniseries, an attempt to condense and adapt a 1,200-page book into a TV miniseries that ended up with a runtime only as long as a long movie. However, with a character-defining performance from Tim Curry, was long thought to be the best possible adaptation of the story, or possibly the best adaptation yet of a Stephen King book. Was it? Setting aside any other contenders, we'll be taking a look at the more recent adaptations of the story in the coming weeks. If you enjoyed the video, I'd love for you to become a part of the channel by subscribing. Thanks for watching.